All right, cool. So we are live on the recording. So Marshall, thank you for joining me on the Spiritual Nomad podcast. And thank you for your podcast that has drawn us to this moment in time to be able to have this conversation. And really looking forward to this podcast. It's been a couple of weeks in the making. And so finally able to sit down and chat with you. So thank you so much for carving out a little bit of time this morning.
I think it's actually
So
been a couple of months in the making. You know, we've been trying to connect and we haven't been able to. So I'm glad finally we can. Yeah.
yeah, I know it was like back and forth, and I think you said my email went to junk mail,
Right. That's what happened last time. I would have emailed you back a week ago, but you know,
it happens. I don't know what that is. It's I don't know, Gmail or something. Just a lot of people find my emails in their junk, so I don't know what's up with that. But so I found your podcast, and so for the listeners, Marshall does a podcast called The Tao of Christ. And I was just scrolling on Spotify and trying to find something new. I was going to go on a jog or something, and suggested to me was the Tao of Christ from Spotify. And I was like, this is exactly my sort of flavor right here, you know? So I clicked on it and immediately just fell in love with your cadence and just what you carry and how you articulate. It's just wonderful. Really enjoy it. And I love your understanding of the Gospels, how you've been going through the book of John and really showing the non-dual reality of the life of Jesus. And that's just like cool water on a hot day for me. And I know for so many people. And so I want to talk about a little bit about, like I said, your faith foundation, formation. I know a little bit from listening to the podcast, but for those that are going to be new, probably going to ask some simple questions about that. And then also just how that has taken a sort of more non-dual or mystic route as you've gotten older and more wise and all of these things that you're now sharing with us through the podcast. So anyways, not to ramble all day. I'm curious. So did you grow up in a Christian faith? Were you exposed to that at a young age?
Yes, of course. I grew up in the 50s. And back then, everybody went to church. It was just kind of a standard cultural thing to do. So I grew up in a congregational church in Massachusetts. And the congregational church in Massachusetts is really the heirs of the Puritans and the original Pilgrims and all of that. That became the congregational church. So that's what I grew up in. And I went through the normal, you know, things that kids do and young teens do. Although I began to question things relatively early when I was a young teenager. In fact, in my early teens, I was reading a lot of atheist literature.
Really?
Yes, I was reading. I can't believe it now that I look back on it. You know, when I'm 13 or 14, or I was reading like Camus, and I was reading Sartre, and I was reading. You know.
Where did you find this stuff? Just like I mean,
how would you? I don't know. I have no idea. Of course, there wasn't any internet. I look back on it now. I don't know how I came across this, but I did, and I was reading it, and I even kind of considered myself kind of like an existentialist or something like that, even at that young age.
Wow.
But then I went away to a prep school actually when I was 15, and at that school there was it was a Methodist related school, although it was very loosely related to the Methodist Church. But they had a chaplain, and they had and everyone was supposed to take 2 religion courses during their time there in the sophomore year and the senior year. And one was on philosophy of religion, and one was on ethics. And it was not those classes, as well as the conversations I would have with the professor, that really got me thinking, you know, more and more deeply about such things. But so I was interested in religious things, even though I really wasn't religious. And even when I went away to college, would still really have considered myself pretty much an atheist, even though I was interested in spiritual things. So I was seeking, you could say.
Yeah.
And and when I went to college, it was right when the Death of God movement was starting. It was on the front page of Time magazine, this black cover in red letters, God is dead,
Yeah.
And the professor of the Religion 101 had he was a young man, and he had just written a book on the Death of God movement. So I enrolled in his course when I was a sophomore there. Even though
Really?
I wasn't a religion major, I was actually a geology major. I was going to be a scientist, and I got into his course, and that just sparked something in me. This type of spiritual search and spiritual interest, and I ended up switching my major to a religion major, and so that was what really began my spiritual search through a lot of different aspects of spirituality. I really became fascinated with the religions of the world.
Yeah.
And I studied that more than anything else. So I took a lot of religion courses because I was a religion major then, and a lot of philosophy courses, including Chinese philosophy, which is how I got interested in the Tao Te Ching, and actually
Yeah.
Chinese language I took from the same professor there, which we actually translated parts of the Tao Te Ching.
Really?
Yeah,
That's fun.
as undergraduate. So I was really interested in that, but I don't want to make this really long, but I was going through some emotional things and relational things, and as a result of all of that, eventually I did have a what they would call then and even now a born again experience. So I really became an evangelical Christian, a born again Christian.
Yeah. Where
And
was that at? Like, where did you have that experience at?
where I had that in Massachusetts. I had dropped out of college for a while,
Okay.
and I was working in my family business, which was a hardware store in Salem, Mass. And I used to take my lunch breaks when it was warm. We used to actually walk up to the Unitarian church, and I
Okay.
would just have a time of meditation in the Unitarian church. Or I would go to the Salem Willows, which was on the coast, because Salem's on the ocean, of course. And I would just sit there, and I would meditate, and I would pray, and I would read the Bible. I had at that time a paperback copy of the Good News Bible, Good News for Modern Man. One of
Okay.
these.
That's
Yeah, so I
so cool.
used to read that, and as a result of all of that, and I had already met and was dating. Who was going to become my wife, my girlfriend, and she was a preacher's kid.
Okay.
She was a Baptist preacher's kid.
How did she, as a Baptist preacher's kid, I'm sorry to
Yeah,
cut
sure.
off that flow, but when you're talking about meditation or dropping into the Unitarian church or
Yeah.
translating the Tao, what's some of that like? Was she like freaked out by that?
A bit, a bit. It's definitely out of the norm for Baptists to be doing
For
that.
sure,
Yeah,
especially
right,
given the time. I mean, even
right,
today, it's
yeah,
very odd.
yeah. But she listened to me. I listened to her, and so that's what really got me attracted once again to Christianity, and to really take Christianity seriously.
Mhm.
I don't think I would have if I hadn't gotten to know her and her parents. Of course, her father was a Baptist preacher, and in Cincinnati, which was in Ohio, which is not too far from where we went to college together. My wife and I were at college. So when I was in Massachusetts at that time, and that crucial time in my life, I started attending a Baptist church there. And it was
Mm.
actually through that Baptist church that I made this commitment,
Mm.
this evangelical commitment to Christ, and was baptized there in in a river right at the mouth of the river as it goes into the ocean. So it was at a public beach is what it was basically.
That's cool.
Yeah, it was good. It was good. It was a.
What was that like? I mean, to make a evangelical commitment to follow Jesus after because a lot of people, not a lot of people, I mean, everybody's so unique and has their own experience, but in my experience and from the people that I've run with, it seems like they exclusively have a sort of Christian or Baptist understanding, and then they go to college or somewhere, or in this day and age, find YouTube, and they start exploring Eastern religion in some ways. Sounds like you had kind of almost a backward, not necessarily fully backwards, but a different approach to that. So what was it like to feel like you were abandoning something that had an interest to you to commit yourself to this other new experience of evangelicalism?
It was a struggle, because the group that I became part of after I became a Christian was a conservative group. And so they didn't take kindly to these other religious traditions. So I had to struggle with that. And I tried to convince myself that the evangelical way was right, even though I knew from experience that these other spiritual traditions had a lot to offer. So I never really abandoned a broader understanding of spiritual truth, even after committing myself and my life to Christ at that time. And then very shortly after I made that commitment, then I had the first of three of these non-dual experiences of this unitive awareness of union with God and with Christ. And that was, I was still in college at that time. And I was outside with my wife, with my girlfriend, who would later become my wife a year later or so. And it was just a dissolution of myself as an individual, and an awareness of God completely as everything that was and everything that is. Yeah. And I tell people that, and people knew me at that time, and I tell them that there was no LSD involved in that experience at all, or anything else, Because
that's very common to the psychedelic experience.
Right. But that's not where I was at the time, Yeah. So this was truly a spiritual experience, and it really hit me to my core. My wife was with me at the time, actually, outside. We were just kind of looking at the stars, in a clear night, and I just began to shake physically as well as inside. So that from that time on, that even though that faded, that became the touchstone, if you will, of my awareness of who God is. So everything else in Christianity began to be filtered through that, even when I would later on kind of try to push that aside and reject that, still it stayed as something very, very deep that I knew was present. And from then on, I went on to seminary. After I graduated from college, I went to a Southern Baptist seminary.
Yeah.
No, but
the Southern Baptist Seminary, right?
The Southern Baptist Seminary in Louisville, Kentucky.
Yeah.
That was a time when you would never use the word progressive and Southern Baptist together today. Yeah. But back then, the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary really was progressive as far as Baptists were concerned.
Right.
It very quickly changed in the early 80s, and it with what they call the fundamentalist takeover of the Southern Baptist Convention. And all my professors were kicked out or resigned before they got kicked out. So it was a very different place after that. But I did at that time study the world's religions. They had a world religion missions department. I took all the courses
Southern
I could take.
Baptist?
Yeah, Southern Baptist. In fact, I took a doctoral seminar in Islam while I was there.
No way.
Yeah, so they wouldn't have it there today.
Right.
But
I have a friend that went there.
Oh, you did?
Yeah. I was telling him about your podcast because he's, exploring Eastern religions now. but he was a graduate from the Southern Baptist Seminary. I moved here from Indianapolis, Indiana, so not far
Oh,
from
okay.
Louisville.
Okay.
And yeah, he was like, I said, yeah, I'm listening to this podcast, The Tao of Christ. And actually he, is an alumni from Southern Baptist. He's like, send me this podcast because there is no way anybody's talking about the Tao from there. But
Right.
apparently it was a different world, huh?
It
Back
was.
then.
It was a different world. It was a very enriching educational and intellectual experience, which is not the case now, and unfortunately.
Yeah.
But anyway, so I went through that, and I was going to teach. Actually, my plan was to go on to a graduate school. In fact, I had was talking to Harvard Divinity School to get into a study of world religions, but I ended up not doing that, and I ended up pastoring a church. Basically, we ran out of money. We needed we had two kids, and I couldn't afford to be a student any longer, So I decided, well, I'm going to go pastor a church, and then maybe I'll come back. I'll go to get a doctorate later on, but that never happened. I ended up getting a doctorate. It was a doctor of ministry degree, which is a practical degree rather than an academic degree. So it had to do with pastoral ministry. But even my dissertation, when I was doing my doctor of ministry, was about the developing the historical and theological identity of a federated church, which most people haven't heard of, but it's a church, it's a dually aligned church with connected to two denominations. And my particular church actually had a lot of people from other denominations besides those two that we had, which were Baptist and Methodist. And we affirmed all of those denominational backgrounds.
Yeah.
Whether it be Episcopalian or Unitarian, we allowed everyone to be who they were doctrinally while being part of this community church. So
I like
it
that.
was so it was a very good experience. So I was part of that church. But
during that time, I know, like in your podcast, you've talked about, I think it was like you said, you made a beautiful analogy of like 40 years of you being in more of an evangelical faith tradition and aligning that with, then moving from that into more of a unitive awareness and things. What was that like to feel like that faithful soldier in your heart through pastoring? Because, as being a pastor myself, it's hard to help walk people through some of this stuff and be with people through that. People are really looking to a pastor to have the answers, to tell them what to do, tell them how to live, the church to be there for them. What was that like when you had experiences, but yet you're walking with people through this and feeling the need to have solid evangelical foundation? Did you feel the need to have that, like as you were pastoring people through that time, or what was that 40 years like for you?
Well, at the beginning, my first church that I had in Illinois, I came in with a more traditional evangelical perspective, and I was there for 4 years, I guess. And then I moved on to this church in New Hampshire, which I was at for 12 years. It's more open church that I was telling you about, this community church. And here, I could affirm all these questions and doubts that they were going through, that I had gone through in my own life. So it was a wonderful time, and I did not feel the pressure from hardly anybody. Of course, there were always a few, but there's hardly anybody to stick to the core traditional, way, the teachings, of the church.
Yeah.
But in fact, is during the later part of my time when I was here for those 12 years, I did a meditation group where we explored all different types of meditation, and people still talk about that being as one of the best times in their lives. Those couple of years that we did that, we met every week and we explored all types of meditation. So it was, it was a good time for me.
Yeah.
but then something happened to me. I was at that time working through a program for spiritual directors at the Shalem Institute in Washington, D.C.
Mm.
And as part of that, I did a week-long silent retreat down there in Washington. And while I was there, in one of these sessions of meditation, is when I had another one of these experiences, just like I had back in 1972. And this was 1992. This is 20 years later.
Wow.
It's where the 40 years comes in. It's going to be 40 years at all. And that one was much more overpowering than the first one, where it really was what I experienced to be the death of the ego, or the death of the self. And I literally said that to the leaders of the retreat, that I felt like I was dying, not physically dying, didn't have to go to the hospital,
Right.
I wasn't having a psychotic break or something like that, but spiritually, I just felt like I no longer existed, and it wouldn't stop. Like the first experience 20 years before, it just kind of came and went, and an hour or two later, it was back to normal. This would not stop for days and days and days, and ended up being weeks. And
what was that like? Can you talk me through some of the details, like the elements of that?
There weren't many details. Other than void, other than this kind of emptiness, but not, and ceasing to be, and the universe ceasing to be, really. So it still today is beyond my words to describe. I cannot put words around it. And that's why I think the leaders of the retreat had such a hard time dealing with me at the time. And I ended up leaving early, and I came home and I met with my spiritual director then, because to be part of this spiritual direction program, you have to be under spiritual direction. So I met with my spiritual director here, and she didn't know what to make of it either. And she consulted with her group of spiritual directors, in order to get back with me. And they helped some. They did help some as far as visualization to deal with this. But it continued, and it continued for weeks. I don't remember how long now, but it was well over a couple of months. And as a result, and I didn't get a whole lot of help from these spiritual leaders that should have known, I think, what was going on. Because this is well documented. This is really the dark night of the soul, and this is what we would call today, the dissolution of the ego. So, which does not really exist. It's just an illusion, but we grasp onto it, and when we see through that, then there's nothing there. And so it's well known now, but it wasn't well known then. And as a result, I didn't know what was going on. So I basically retreated back from it. I became, this was too scary for me, and so I kind of retreated back into the evangelicalism that I had known long before.
Right.
So I became a much more conservative person. I said, where I could have some easy answers, clear, straightforward. The Bible says it, I believe it. I'm not going to listen to anything else, So that's what I did. I left that church, and I went to a more conservative church. Where in Massachusetts, and then I went to an even more conservative church out in Pennsylvania, Western Pennsylvania, where I could dive into this, and I got immersed in the new Calvinism.
I was in that groove myself.
That the Southern Baptist Seminary was really into, because of the L. Mohlers that is the president of Southern Seminary, and he's one of the leaders of this new Calvinism. So I just immersed myself in this with this kind of doctrinal certainty, and it worked for a while. I was there for 11 and a half years, and it worked for that time, and the church thrived during that time. It really grew, and people were coming, and it was great as far as the numbers were concerned. But things were going on with me too, and I ended up taking a sabbatical after I'd been there 10 years or so. And when I came back, I had found out that the previous pastor, who was the pastor emeritus, who had been there for 30 years, had taken it into his mind to get me kicked out of the church.
Oh.
Yeah, so he was passing around petitions and trying to stir up the opposition to get me voted out of the church.
No
So I
way.
came back to this, and it came back to this terrible church division and conflict and everything like this, which really did a number on me emotionally, you know, and I ended up resigning, and then the church said, no, stay. So I stayed for a little bit longer, then I resigned again, and I got out of it. I needed just to get away from religion completely, you know.
Yeah.
And for a year and a half, I had the financial resources to be able to take a year off without having to be a pastor or anything. So I said, okay, for this 1 year, I'm just going to explore. I'm going to look at everything, look at the very foundations of my faith and of reality. And I'm going to use the word that you used before, deconstruct, you know, my whole worldview, which is what I did. And I did that mostly through reading the New Atheists, all the New Atheist movement, because they were the ones who were at the time, and this was in 2009, 10, they were the ones who were doing this most visibly in the culture. So I read everything I could, and they were very, very helpful. I ended up writing a book later, which is my biggest book I ever wrote, entitled "Thank God for Atheists," because they showed me, you know, that the God that most theists believe in is not real.
Yeah.
And the God that I had believed in as a evangelical Christian was not real.
Right.
That I had dedicated my life to someone that was not, you know.
Yeah.
So I was exploring that more and more and more, and so I ended up doing that, deconstructing my whole Christian faith for that year and a half, for that year, and then it ended up being a year and a half because I decided, you know, I was still spiritually interested in things. I was still reading some things. In fact, then I started listening to some podcasts by some Zen teachers at that time. So I started to dip my toes back into spirituality, because I knew from my previous experiences that the spiritual realm was real. It's just that this theistic construction was not real.
Right.
So I was trying to get back to what I knew was real without this
the image that we like to cling to. Yes.
Right. So I ended up, after a year, trying to find a new church, and this church that I had pastored before in New Hampshire opened up again. And they called me and asked if I was interested in coming back. And I said, sure, I'll be interested in that. So I met with them and talked about it, and they called me back. So I was, so that was in 2011 that I came back here. And my sermons at that time were still part of this whole deconstruction process. I would be preaching sermons on, is God real? You know, who is Jesus? Is Jesus the only way? You know, so my preaching was all questions. It wasn't answers. It was all questions. And people were saying, this is great, because they had these questions that they weren't able to ask. Because churches tend to give answers rather than ask questions.
Absolutely.
And I was saying, spirituality really is about asking the right questions. It's not about giving the right answers. So I was preaching questions. That's what I was doing.
Yeah.
And then in 2012, I can remember the date. I won't say what the date is, but I can remember the date because it was my wife's birthday. And I had a third experience. So that's that 40-year period from the very first one. I had shortly before then, actually on that day, I had been told by a primary care physician that I had pancreatic cancer and that I would not have long to live.
Mm.
So this doctor said, you better get your friends at church together to pray for you. So that was on my wife's birthday, and I had planned a big party for her because it was her 60th birthday. So I had a band that was going to come, and I had all
That's
friends
fun.
come, and we all went to the community center. And here, my wife and I were just sitting here, feeling terrible in the midst of what was supposed to be a party.
Yeah.
And it ended up, after they did more tests, after a week. And I got the test back. After a week, they realized they had misdiagnosed me. I did not have pancreatic cancer. After all these scans and everything of my whole body, they ended up being my gallbladder, which is a lot easier to deal with.
Yeah.
I just took out the gallbladder, and I was fine after that. But what that did was that for that week, I had to deal with my mortality in a way I never had to deal with it before. You can deal with it, theoretically. You can deal with it, with the death of people that you know and love, family members, and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
But when you're dealing with your own non-existence to happen soon, then it is a whole different thing, and that gave birth to a third experience where I fully accepted this reality that I did not exist really as an ego, as a psyche, or even as a physical person, that it was only God that existed, and I was one with this God, which is the reality of the universe, not the theistic God,
Right.
the judgmental Father sitting on the throne, but the ground of being that Paul Tillich talks about, being itself.
Yes.
This being itself, which is the universe, is identical with the being that I am. And that took hold at that time in 2012. And ever since that time, it's been unfolding for these last 8 years since then. So I've been able to kind of rest back into it and integrate it more into my normal daily life, and to be able to articulate it better, which is why I really started the podcast and the YouTube channel.
Yeah.
Is that it was a way for me to get it out there, to get my ideas out there, so that it was a way for me to think it through.
Yes. Yeah.
I can think through things better when I'm writing, or when I'm preaching, or when I'm developing a sermon or something.
I'm the same way. That's how this whole project started.
I don't even know what I'm thinking, and until I start writing, and all of a sudden, this is what I'm thinking. This is how I can describe it. So that's what I've been doing. And this pandemic's been wonderful for me, because it's cut me off from all my normal activities, and I've been able to devote myself to this, completely. So I've been doing this, about Christian non-duality, basically, both the YouTube and the podcast. So I've been doing this, and now I do a podcast every 3 days or so.
So how has in this whole unfoldment, and what I love about it, and it's same for me and for a lot of other people, is experience seems to be the thing that catapults us into new understandings of the true self, and to understanding that, and those experience define, or I don't know if that's a good word, define or bring more mystery into the reality of our existence, And I'm curious just how Jesus has taken on different shapes and formations for you, in these more recent years, because for a lot of people, they look at their experience and then they look at their doctrine and they're like, they don't quite always match up, but I don't know, doctrine is this, we always want to cling to images. That's always our natural leaning. And so that's why, like, Calvinism to me, whenever I was in my early 20s, was great, because it had a y equals mx plus b about the divine mystery. You know what I mean? Right. And it's like, cool, I can latch myself onto that. It was trending, around, from 2008 was whenever I really got exposed. Like 2012 is where that started to taper off for me. But it was an image that I could hold to. But I grew up in the charismatic church and the vineyard churches, and it was very experiential. And so what's amazing to me is as people deconstruct these formative or, formulaic doctrines, many of us who have had experiences begin to see those in more of a real way, and those begin to become more of truth. It's like the mythos and logos of what is, is it logic or is it this sort of narrative? And these experiences become the narrative that then like is the lens that we see our life through. And for me, it was like, well, if I'm going to reform faith in some way based on my experience and the knowledge of my unitive awareness, and I still want to, for me, it was, I still wanted to, felt called, if you will, or drawn to the Christian faith. I had to begin to see what was the experience of Jesus, what was the experiences that he lived through. And if I'm going to follow that, how does Jesus then incorporate into my experience that transcends doctrines and dogmas and all of these things? And so I'm curious for you how Jesus has evolved with you, what Jesus means to you in this time. And for a lot of our listeners, they're trying to figure out what do they do with their Christian upbringing and how to sort through that and if it has a place or not.
Yes, my understanding of Christ has changed from just from the individual man to the cosmic Christ, if you will, which is right there in the scripture as far as the logos, the universal Christ. And my understanding is that this universal Christ is the inspiration behind all spirituality and not just Christianity. But another aspect you haven't mentioned, which has become very important to me, is the whole idea of relationship. Because for evangelicals, it's not religion, it's a relationship.
Yeah,
right?
Totally.
It's all about having a relationship with Jesus Christ or a relationship with God. And for me now, it's not about religion or about relationship. It is about identity. It is about who I am in Christ. Or as one with Christ.
Yes.
And the relationship itself has to be dualistic because it has to be two to be a relationship, But in non-duality, there is not two. So you don't have a relationship. You have an identity. So when Jesus says, I and the Father are one, that's what he's talking about. He's talking about something that transcends a relationship between father and son. He's talking about a unity. He's talking about unity of awareness.
Yes.
So that is the major shift, I think, that I have found in my life, that shift from religion to relationship to identity with Christ. So now I look at Christ, I don't try to think about Christ so much as I try to, I know this is going to sound offensive to people, be Christ,
No, yeah,
let
absolutely.
Christ be in me. I mean, and me be in Christ. And there's a lot of biblical, places you can look for that too.
Absolutely.
The Father is in me and I am in the Father, Jesus says. And I think that we can have that same, I think Jesus is a model for us for how to be.
Yeah.
He isn't just our Savior, but we are to become one in him, one with him. And Christians tend to not want to get too deeply into this non-dualistic language, but that's where I tend to go, simply based on my own awareness and my own experience. Like you talked about experience, I almost hate to even use the word experience because what I am talking about really is something which experiences happen within. It's so it's not an experience so much. It is I use the word awareness, but even that's not very good. It's something. It's a substratum beneath that upholds in which all experiences happen. That's what I'm, and that is where we are one with God and one with Christ.
Right. And it informs this sort of state of being, if you will, at least in this incarnation.
Yes.
And that's because you're right. I mean, experience sounds kind of like, and it does happen sometimes as events, but it's really more of an invitation into a state of being, of living and moving, having your being. And I always bring up about Paul. I had being attracted to the Calvinistic movement, I had a really hard time getting over Paul because, Reformed folks, they say they worship Jesus, but it's really all about Paul. And I had a really hard time approaching that. And I still do in many regards, but Christ in me, he says, the mystery hidden throughout the ages is Christ in me, the hope of glory.
Right.
And it's like, so this is the mystery. Revealed is the reality that I am a incarnation of Christ myself.
Right.
And how aware am I to that reality? And to me, like, that is, quote, reconstruction in a way, because now it transcends all of the theological gymnastics that we have to do. It really, that takes a peripheral view to the state of conscious awareness that we live in a very meaningful, intentional way as far as incarnation goes, just as Jesus did. Because of that unitive awareness, he was enabled and empowered by the Spirit, if you will, to live that sort of life. And so I think for me, reconstruction is held that. And for so many that are listening to this, I feel like that our talking about this is just greater invitation to their thing, and to also not, for me, and I'm curious for you too, like when you begin to read some of the Zen and you start to look into more of the Eastern religions, some folks that I know, including myself, we want to just attach and cling to some other form. And I remember having to come to the conclusion of, I was really attracted like Hinduism. And then I'm like, at the end of the day, I can't be a Hindu. I don't know it like I know this tradition. I can do the best I can and interpret the best I can. But we have a tendency to always want to cling and attach. How did you work through some of that? Did you work through some of that? And as people are trying to reconstruct faith, what would be some words of the wise as to people as they journey and seek and to beware of attachment?
I think Christ is incarnated in all different cultural and spiritual traditions. And the best way that we can be faithful to that is to incarnate it in our cultural, spiritual tradition. So we are, Americans, and even though America is not a Christian nation, still it is a dominant, Christianity is the dominant religion of America. And if we have had been part of Christianity for much of our life, that is the way we think, that's the way we speak, that's the language that we use. And I see no reason that we have to abandon that in order to adopt a whole nother cultural language. I mean, I struggle when I read Hindu material, but with all the Indian terms, I know what a lot of them mean, but they don't connect to me at a deep level. Like words like Son of God, or like incarnation, or like, or Holy Spirit. I mean, these words connect to me at a very deep level, and the others don't. And it was almost like starting all over again. You say, oh, I'm not gonna be part of the Christian tradition anymore. I'm going to be part of the Hindu Vedanta, Advaita tradition. I'm going to be part of that. And why do that? It's not necessary. If all is one, and if all spiritual traditions really are drawing upon the same well, why not stick with the well that you already have and drink deeply of that and articulate it better? And for me, as a pastor and as a preacher, I almost feel an obligation to proclaim this good news to those who are in my same tribe, if you will, this Christianity, this Christian movement, because I really think this is what Jesus was proclaiming, and this is what at least some of the New Testament writers are proclaiming. I'm going through the Gospel of John, as you mentioned in my podcast, and I really think that the Apostle John and whoever the final author editor of that gospel is really knew what this is all about. I
Yeah.
mean, that's the clearest voice, I think, in the whole Bible, as far as
Agreed.
non-duality is concerned. Now, Apostle Paul had this experience too, and some of the things he says are right in there. And I quote him a lot in Galatians, no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. He
Yeah.
knew what this was about, but there's another part of him that could never let go of the Pharisee,
Yes. Yeah.
and he always was that. And then Pauline Christianity that developed after Paul, that we see in the pastoral epistles that I think are written by another Pauline author. They go even further away. And then after we get beyond the biblical period, then it just becomes Pauline, or this post-Pauline Christianity. So the original heart of the message has been completely lost. It was tried to recover for a while in the second century, and even in the early third century with the desert fathers and mothers, in Eastern Orthodoxy, in Egypt especially,
Yeah.
with what is often called Gnosticism.
Mm-hmm.
But that was squelched, and branded heretical
Right.
by the fourth century, and then Christianity basically lost it, except for occasional voices in the monastic tradition.
Yeah.
So
I'm curious, even you bring up so Gnosticism's been a fun exploration for me. And what do you ever read through some of the Nag Hammadi scriptures and things like that?
Yes, I did. I think it's great. I think the Nag Hammadi scrolls are wonderful. The Gospel of Thomas in particular, I think is wonderful. I think it is as old, if not older, than the canonical Gospels that we have.
Yes.
And it is this voice that was not allowed to be. I think Christianity very early got taken over by Jesus' brother James, and by Paul.
Yeah.
And those are the two voices we hear. We don't hear anything about these other apostles.
Right.
And I think these other apostles knew what this was all about, and their voices were crushed,
Right.
like Thomas. Thomas is, of course, traditionally the apostle that went to India.
Yes.
And in fact, I was just talking to a man came to visit me who is from that part of India, who's a Christian who listens to my podcast, and he came to visit me, and he was telling me about that, which I think is interesting.
Really?
Yes. So there is a Thomas group of Christians, in India and in the world, and I think they have the authentic gospel too.
Yeah.
And I think there are echoes of it in the synoptic gospels, even though I don't think they were written by the apostles, and I don't think they really knew what the core of Jesus' message was.
Right. Yeah, it was definitely more from early on. Christianity had very much an agenda that we still see in the spirit of Christianity today. It's a very much dictated by personal agenda. And certainly there was times of being burned alive and all sorts of, there's not always been that political connection, right? But there's always been some sort of the conversion idea of Western Greco-Roman society. It seems like that just is such a permeating piece of Christianity all the way to Paul, and understanding he's never really gotten over that Pharisee-ness, I tell people. Right. And you can read it right into the scriptures and the obsession. I just watched a movie actually on Amazon Prime or something. It's called Red Bad, and it's about this Swedish king essentially, and they came over. The Franks came to overtake their land and to convert everyone to Christianity, and made them renounce all their pagan gods and such. And it's interesting that his name, it says at the end of the movie, that he was removed from history because of Christianity's narrative of history, and you see them in the movie taking people, and they're screaming and yelling, and they're dunking them in the water and holding them under the water, and making them, do you believe that Jesus is the only son of God? Using all this very, yes or no sort of dualistic language. And I think that is a very caricatured, it certainly happened then, but even today, we kind of do that in certain ways to force people into submission, into a yes or no, black or white, in or out sort of
Right.
reality. And it's hard to fault people in some ways, because you read the Bible and it's like, well, I mean, it's kind of tied into the fabric of this whole thing. And I think the Nag Hammadi scriptures help bring a completely new paradigm to and widen the voices. Anytime that we get more people speaking, obviously we get more perspectives and paradigms that give a more bigger story
Right.
and more witnesses. That's a really long way to say that I think the Nag Hammadi scriptures help us get away from this sort of clear, defined yes or no, in or out language that we found ourselves in this reformed, influenced Christianity,
Right.
and more into awe and wonder, and even, just the stories that you read are, like, wow, I never even knew that was a part of Christian history. Oh, well, you wouldn't know because they X'd it all out, It's like,
Yeah, Christianity was a very broad movement in the first century and in the second
yes.
century and even in the third century. It was just had so many different voices to it, to use your term, and so many different aspects, and it was too big. And I think, historically, Constantine probably had a lot to do with it. He
Mm-hmm.
he wanted to have one type of Christianity that he could found his government and his empire on. So he had to have one set of doctrine. So you had to exclude all these others. And so they were
Right.
all, made into heresy, and they were all burned or they were hidden. Fortunately, in the desert in Egypt, so we could find them as the Nag Hammadi scrolls, So we suddenly realize that that there are a lot of different ways of interpreting Christ, a lot of different gospels, and these ones that made it into a Bible just happened to be the winners. They were the
Yep.
ones that the people in authority said, this is the right one, and all the rest are not right.
Yeah. The
So
heavily edited winners in some case
Right,
too,
right, exactly. Yeah. And the thing is that, as you were talking, I was thinking to myself, this is happening again now in our culture now. I think this whole idea, I think the religious right and its coupling with politics uh, is a new theocracy that is trying to do the same type of thing. Is
Yeah.
trying to
Yeah.
it's a real danger to religious liberty, even though they tend to be the ones that talk about religious liberty. They are the danger, I think,
Mm.
to religious liberty. It's the way I understand it. As a Baptist, Baptists have always been champions of religious liberty because we were the ones that were persecuted all the time.
Mm-hmm.
Roger Williams, he got kicked out of Massachusetts by the Puritans
Mm.
because he didn't abide by their Calvinistic doctrine,
Right. Right.
and so he founded a place where anybody, Rhode Island, where anybody could believe what they wanted to. And the Baptists have always valued that. And now I hear and I read Baptists who are going against this religious liberty.
Mm.
They want to become the new Puritans,
Yeah.
that will say who's in and who's out. And
Yes.
it's scary, really.
Yeah. It is. And I think it's gives way for something new to emerge. And that's what I think that a lot of the people who are exploring this, people like you and your podcast, are giving way to a new religious liberty. And it may not be exactly through, traditions that we've seen as like Baptists or whatever, but there is something new that's emerging. And I was doing a podcast with someone and they said, it might even need a new name or something. I don't know if we really need to name it. I'm not really as
Yeah.
interested in that as I am about the essence and the heart of what is bringing freedom. I mean, once again, to quote Paul, for freedom, Christ has set you free. So if you have the living Christ within, there is a sense of freedom and liberty that comes in that. And so that's my only hope, is to empower people to grow into some sense of liberty. And if it has a definition, or if it has a new movement, or it has this or that, so be it. But in my experience, it's going to always end up, somebody's going to be outside of that group. So why didn't you even name it? Let it be whatever it's going to be.
Right. Yeah.
And in that, but you're right. I think that people have become more conservative, more strict. Even like I've seen people, even my dad, for instance, who's a pastor, he's become it seems like more like, well, what do you mean by that? Like I use the word meditation a lot, and he watched a video for our church and he's like, we only said meditation twice. People are going to think you're into some Eastern stuff, whatever. And it's like, I am,
Right.
Right. So it's like people have gotten, and what I think is, and I certainly don't want to get too political. I know we have people from all over the spectrum, but when people sense that something's being taken away from them, they grab it tighter. And that happens to us with our ego as we begin to explore a lot of this.
Right.
And like you said, you went, you turned right back into deep conservatism. And I have another friend who she was exploring and evolving and got freaked out to an extent and just made a hard U-turn back into apologetics and things, you know. And it can be freaky when you're sensing that you're losing an image of yourself. And I think Christianity at large right now is losing an image of itself. So it's trying to grab onto it, but the tighter you grab, it's like sand in your hands. It's just going to fall out of your fingers that much more quickly, you know? And so, yeah.
I'm hoping that this new awareness that's developing here will not develop a name or an organization, because
I agree.
For the same reasons that you alluded to, that as soon as you do, then you set up the boundaries, and boundaries means there's a dualism. You know? So, and I think maybe that's why this original gospel did not survive beyond the 4th century. Is because it was too amorphous. It didn't have a hierarchy. It didn't have power. It didn't have people, wanting to be the top guy, the Pope,
Right.
They were completely fine with everybody, no matter who they were, being the leaders. And a lot of them were women in these early movements. But the men couldn't handle that, so they had to crush that down. And so I hope that this is more of a movement rather than an organization, or certainly not a set of beliefs, not even non-dual beliefs, because that's a contradiction in itself. You can't have non-dual beliefs,
right?
I mean, so whatever I say about non-duality, I have to say, I could say the opposite at the same time. It's this, because it always has to be nuanced by and explained more and more. So it's hard for people to get a hold of, basically because you can't get a hold of it with your mind.
Right.
And you can't even get a hold of it with your emotions. You can't get a hold of it at all. You have to let go.
Yes.
And you have to kind of rest into this, who you really are and what God really is and reality really is. And you just rest in that, and then everything's fine. Then you have the peace, that passeth understanding. But
it's the paradox.
Yes, it is. Yeah.
And the embracing of paradox, I think, has been monumental. And I want to be respectful of your time as we start to close. I think as people begin to reconstruct a faith, I started the deconstruction of my own life around 2015, and started this podcast in 2017 after a kind of a false start church plant that didn't quite pan out for a lot of reasons, because I was deep into deconstruction, and you can't start, any sort of community if you yourself don't know who you are and have your identity in all different sorts of places. But you can easily find yourself misidentifying who you really are with these images, with these things. And as people go into deconstruction, I think they can sort through some of that, and then reconstruction helps us sort of identify this new way of being that has to include paradox. And so I guess ramble for a moment, but paradox is one of the biggest elements, in my opinion, of a reconstructed faith.
Yes.
Because for so many people who are deconstructed, like a lot of my friends, I can't even walk into a church. How could you even sit through a worship service? Or, I have a friend who I was on staff at a church nearby, and he's like, I can't even go in. Like, I can't do it. And I think there is some sort of security in the liminality that you have to find, of the paradox of like, I can be somewhere and hold two truths to be true. And they're in the mystic understanding is I can't cling to either of those truths. It's going to be somewhere that is in this eternal gray, you know? And so I love what you've been articulating, because it's so much paradox that you have demonstrated by the way that you've lived your life. You've been in the church, yet had experiences, held on to them, yet have gone to more strict belief. But it really is a sort of flow, not necessarily a timeline in a way, you know? And so I'm curious if you have any other thoughts. Like, so for my ideas, like, man, maybe paradox is the thing of embracing, which you can't like train somebody to do. You got to just, it happens to you, you know? But I'm curious, any like last thoughts or things to help people as they move through that liminal space of deconstruction into a functioning that even that's neither here. I don't know if that's even the right language for it, but.
Well, I would say that I am part of the church now. I go to a church regularly, a United Methodist church. The pastor there tends to be very open to these things. We studied one of my books there, one of the study groups, and I preached there. And I also preach at the church that I used to pastor once in a while when I'm asked to. So, and I still am a church person, and I can recite the Apostles' Creed at this church, and I can do that. Of course, my meaning of these terms is very different, you know, than what a lot of people who are reading these mean by it. But I can read it in a symbolic way and in a mystical way and feel completely at home at it, and don't feel the tension that the person you were talking about was, that could not even go into the church. Now, I would have a hard time going into a conservative church that was proclaiming, you know, an exclusivity. I would have a hard time with that. But a person who is open-minded, I have no problem at all. And they don't tend to have a problem with me. I preach once in a while at the Unitarian church nearby. The last time I preached was at a Unitarian church.
So cool.
Which is interesting, because that really is where when I was doing that search back when I was young, you know, and I went into going into the Unitarian church, that's where it all kind of began. Now I've come back, you know, and here I am preaching to these Unitarians who at first, when I first came and they heard that I was a Baptist minister who had gone to a Southern Baptist seminary, I mean, you know, some of them were just, you know, I could see the closeness on their faces. But as soon as I started to explain where I was coming from, the body language, you know, loosened up, you know, and they could hear what I was saying, because I preached about Christian non-duality as a topic of my last sermon there. So I guess I would say that you can be part of a church, of a traditional mainline church, as long as the leadership there is not too narrow-minded. As long as they're open enough to hear some other voices, you can be part of that. Because I think Christian community, and I think the rituals are very rich in our spiritual lives, and they enrich my life. So I would encourage that, and as a final word, I guess.
Yeah, that's so good. And we're church planting now. I mean, obviously it's a different world with coronavirus, but we're focusing on creating spiritual community, reclaiming that. I feel like that is something that I've been really inspired to do for a lot of those reasons. I think spiritual community is one of the things that really bring a sense of connectedness and wholeness. It's an individual and communal experience. I think spirituality across traditions, cultures, has both of those elements included in it to be well-rounded and whole. And so it's really important. Yeah. Not sure if you had a thought on that, but, or I don't know. I thought I heard.
Yes. I mean, this can't be just an individualized spirituality. We can't be these solitary yogis going off into the desert or into the, you know, into the mountains to meditate and become enlightened. You know, at least in the Christian tradition, there is the strong communal sense, and that's true in all traditions. It's true in the Buddhist tradition with the Sangha. It's true in the Hindu with the ashram. So it's true. It's a human human aspect, that this has to be incarnated not only in our individual lives, but in the community, because that's where we can get challenged, and that's where we can learn from other people. Otherwise, the ego starts to take over and deceive us, and we can go all sorts of strange places,
Yeah.
So spiritual community is really essential, I think.
Yeah. So good. So good. So listeners, if you're hearing that and you are someone who is struggling to find a space for spiritual community, certainly reach out. We can see if we can help. And then just an encouragement that truth is found in many places, and still there is truth in the churches,
Right.
And there's still beauty there. There's still awe and wonder to be found. And even myself, like I don't feel a need to start a new denomination. I'm still ordained with the Vineyard churches, until they listen to my podcast. But I'm like, why would I need to go anywhere else? I'll just keep doing what I'm doing here as long as they'll have me. And luckily that it's a movement, not a denomination. So I'll hopefully be able to hang out with them for a little while longer. They have an emphasis on the presence of God, which to me is like the essence of what I care about anyway. So yes. Luckily it's more focused on experience or essence and presence than doctrine. So hopefully they'll have me. But yeah, so friends listening, if you want to talk, have a place to explore, certainly reach out and have myself, people that you can talk with and talk about what is triggering me about these churches. What is this or that, and help find the space, because we all need a space to be known and to belong and to be cared for. And I think we find healing in the communal experience. So Marshall, thank you so much for sharing your story and talking through all of the beautiful topics that we've covered today. And thank you so much for the Tao of Christ. And friends, subscribe. So people, if they want to get in touch with you, if they want to listen, watch on YouTube, where's the best way for them to find all of your info?
My blog is at marshalldavis.us. You can find the podcast at thedaoofchrist.com. Christian non-duality, .net is my YouTube channel. So that's it basically. If you go there, you'll find other links.
Okay. Awesome. Thank you so much.